Как у нас обстоят дела в целом в Узбекистане со свободой слова?
There's still too many red lines and kind of invisible red lines sometimes about some topics that you shouldn't talk about or that you shouldn't touch on.
Поправки в Конституцию – одна из самых таких злободневных тем в Узбекистане последние месяцы.
It's, if you look at world experience, it's there unfortunately is a pattern where if you eliminate term limits or if you extend them for very long periods of time, you end up with government that's not as accountable to the people. The first question I get when I travel around the country is usually something about a visa. That's
Как я могу получить визу?
I believe that we have not yet seen the full impact on the region of Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Что сейчас происходит в мире, господин Розенблюм? Понятно, что там Россия, Путин, Байден и так далее, и так далее. Вообще в целом, что послужило причиной событиям?
Причиной
событиям? Да.
There's a lot of challenges to what people usually refer to as the international order. And when people talk about the international order, they're usually referring to a set of rules and norms and practices that developed in the wake of World War II and institutions that were developed to respond to that, whether it's the United Nations, the international financial institutions like the World Bank, and also just kind of assumptions people made about what's right and what's wrong in international interactions, international relations. And I think what we're seeing is that some countries are challenging those norms and that order, either because they feel it disadvantages them, or because they think it's old-fashioned. We don't need that anymore. We believe, the United States believes, and President Biden has spoken about this many times, that international system that we have of norms, practices, and institutions has served the world well. Has been perfect? Of course not. I mean, yes, there have still been conflicts. Yes, there have still been, horrible abuses and atrocities committed during that time. It hasn't prevented all of that. But on the whole, it's created a much more stable international environment than we had in the first half of the 20th century. And so what he has said and what the United States has said is that we need to do everything we can to mobilize a coalition of countries that believe in those norms and practices and principles and are willing to stand up for them. And when they're challenged by actions like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, like some of the things that China has done in recent years, there needs to be a pushback on that in the name of this international system.
По сути, если я правильно понял, сейчас идет попытка изменить систему, которая в мире находится.
Yes, I think so. I think there's a disregard for this system and a belief that it's disadvantaging certain countries, and therefore they want to change it.
Судя по всему, идет что-то по-настоящему серьезное. Мы, к сожалению, как простые люди, не видим, не знаем, потому что есть куча примеров уже сейчас, которые проходят в СМИ, которые действительно происходят, мы не ожидаем. Та же самая Швейцария, которая всегда была гарантом нейтралитета, которая была нейтральна во Второй мировой войне, сейчас принимает участие в санкциях. У меня такой вопрос, может быть, достаточно банальный. Неужели нацисты лучше, чем Путин, раз при нацизме у них было все хорошо, а при Путине они подключились к этому? Почему так происходит?
So I do think, so you mentioned Switzerland, and another example that you didn't give, but which a lot of people are talking about, is the fact that Sweden and Finland have decided to become members of NATO, right? Which was unimaginable even 2 years ago or a year ago, right? So I mean, I think what's happening is that other countries, most countries that believe in those, again, those principles and norms of international system and the international rule of law, you might say, international order, are worried and alarmed and scared about the challenges to that system, and believe that they want to join up with the part of the world that is standing up for those principles. So, you know, I think that it's really as simple as that. They've made a decision that it's in their national interest to support this coalition that's formed to stand up for those principles. And so that's why some surprising things have been happening in recent months.
Ну, опять-таки, я хотел бы отметить для наших зрителей, возможно, что все-таки я не сторонник ни Российской Федерации, ни, собственно, противников. Я все-таки гражданин Узбекистана. И я переживаю за Узбекистан в первую очередь. Но по сути получается, что все те принципы, о которых говорит Запад, он так или иначе нарушается. То есть тот же самый там, пример со Швейцарией, да, те же самые там, свобода слова, когда не дают по большому счету использовать те же самые инструменты, которые используют, там, не знаю, назовем это США, да, Российской Федерации. То есть социальные сети, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook и так далее, и так далее. Ну, как бы это все просто выключается в этом направлении. Нет ли в этом противоречий?
So I think the important thing to keep in mind in these discussions is what kind of approach do countries take to their own imperfections, right? So, you know, earlier you asked me about being a patriot and what patriotism means, and I said, I think part of being a patriot is that you're willing to be critical of your own country and accept its flaws. But then the question is, well, what happens then? What happens next? And I think in countries like Sweden or Switzerland or the United States, they sometimes do things that are not consistent with certain principles, like, you know, free speech, free media, whatever, you know, choose whatever you want. Yes, of course. I mean, they are, you know, those countries are governed by human beings, and human beings are flawed and make mistakes. But then the question is, what happens then? In those countries, there are corrective mechanisms to make sure that those mistakes are not repeated, or to reverse policy and reverse course, and to ensure that the basic principles of, you know, equal justice and non-discrimination and freedom of speech, freedom of association, all those basic freedoms and rights, which are in universal international documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that those things are respected. And what we don't see the same thing happening in the countries that are challenging the international system. In fact, to the contrary, they are cutting off the ability to be critical or to say anything against government policy. They are not correcting course. In fact, they're doubling down on their course of projecting these challenges to the world. So I think that's an important distinction to make. It's not, you know, they say that if you're looking for consistency and perfect, symmetry or whatever in human affairs, you'll never find it, because human beings are not always consistent. The question is, what have human beings put in place to correct themselves, and checks and balances, corrective actions. So anyway, that's the way I look at that question. But I also think it's important to come back to what's actually happened in, not just in the past few months, but in the past few years, and the gross violation of basic principles like sovereignty and independence and territorial integrity is so clear and so egregious that the world had to react. And I think that accounts for the actions taken even by countries like Switzerland that don't normally get involved in things like sanctions.
Еще один кейс, мне, к сожалению, не с кем его обсудить, поэтому я его с вами обсужу. Это кейс с Amnesty International, которых, согласно, то есть они выдали отчет, да, их сложно, как мне кажется, заподозрить в какой-то предвзятости. Они выдали отчет о том, что СВУ размещает оружие в местах проживания людей и, соответственно, подвергает этому их рискам. Практически вывернули наизнанку эту организацию, заставили извиняться, хотя они не изменили своего мнения, насколько я понимаю, региональный директор ушел в отставку. Это не нарушение ли свободы слова, как вам кажется?
Yeah, well, so, I mean, I don't think anyone has interfered with Amnesty International's ability or right to publish the report. Certainly the U.S. government hasn't forbidden the report from being published or anything of that nature. I think it's, we may be able to, kind of cherry pick a few examples like that where an organization said something critical about Ukraine, but that is kind of like, to me, that's a grain of sand on a very large beach of other grains of sand, millions and millions of grains of sand, pointing to horrific abuses and horrific and brutal attacks by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Russian forces. I mean, 12 million Ukrainians have been displaced by the war, 5 million forced to flee to other countries, 7 million internally. And out of the 7 million who have been internally displaced, there's a lot of evidence and reports indicating that those who are in Russian-occupied territory are being filtered. There's a filtration process happening, and those who are deemed not sufficiently loyal to Russian occupation are being deported to Russia and sent to faraway regions. So just one example, I think it's $108 billion worth of damage to property from Russian bombardment of cities. I could go on and on. The UN says there's 5,200 plus civilians who have been killed, Ukrainian civilians, and they say that's an undercount. Again, all of that these are all facts which lead us to the result of the policies that we've instituted and that a lot of the rest of the world has gone along with. So, again, that's to me, that is the story here. That's what we need to be focused on.
Что такое свобода слова вообще по-вашему? Мы как бы в Узбекистане жаждем свободы слова. Для многих пока это что-то такое не совсем до конца понятное, как мне кажется. То есть это возможность что-то сказать, кого-то, скажем, обидеть, оскорбить, и при этом ничего за это не получить. Да? То есть у нас пока такое понимание. Что же на самом деле такое это свобода слова?
Well, there's been long books written about the legal aspects of freedom of speech and the cultural aspects. I can't say that I'm an expert on the theory and of freedom of speech, but to me, what it means is that you have the right to express your opinions, and you have the right to publish them and distribute them and have other people read them as well. So that means, both speaking and writing. And it also carries with it, freedom of speech carries with it a certain amount of responsibility. I mean, there's the saying that people use in the United States, maybe there's an equivalent in Uzbekistan, is you have the right to free speech, but you don't have the right to yell fire in a crowded theater. If there's no fire. Obviously, if there's a fire, you do want to say that. And so, there, over time and, through history and even in recent times, many governments have put some restrictions or at least put in place some principles and mechanisms to regulate speech and to ensure that it isn't used for things that lead to violence or that make people do things like run out of a crowded theater when when there's nothing happening. So I believe that it is an essential right, but that doesn't mean that it's an unconditional right, that there's absolutely no restrictions that can ever be put.
Как у нас обстоят дела в целом в Узбекистане со свободой слова?
I would say it's important, first of all, to recognize the progress in that area over the past 6 years, say. And comparing things to what they were 6 years ago, I think there's been an expansion of freedom of speech here. People feel freer to say critical things about their government or about anything that's going wrong in their communities, and the ability to print, publish, disseminate on the internet information has grown a lot. But at the same time, I feel that there's still too many red lines and kind of invisible red lines sometimes, although people know where they are usually, even if they're invisible, about some topics that you shouldn't talk about or that you shouldn't touch on. And that is, to me, is not free speech. So there's progress, but there's still some ways to go.
Такой интересный феномен, как мне кажется, наверняка вы о нем тоже знаете. Наши местные журналисты и блогеры, они сами определяют для себя красную линию. То есть это такой элемент самоцензуры. Это интересно. А никто не говорит, что нет звонков там из определенной структуры. Они есть, но не на таком уровне, как это было раньше. И многие мои коллеги, они сами для себя определяют. Нет ли в этом странности?
It is, well, no, actually, I don't think it's strange. And I'll tell you why. Because when you live in a country, in a society that for a long, long time was set very strict limits that were obvious and direct, it's hard to overnight change that attitude and that behavior. You're conditioned, you know, in a certain way. So I'm not surprised. It doesn't surprise me, or nor does it seem strange that people would engage in self-censorship or draw their own red lines. You know, it's almost human nature that you would do that, right? You know, people are inherently cautious and they want to protect themselves from bad consequences.
Красные линии. Можете поподробнее немного? Вот в узбекских СМИ что это за линии?
Well, so
что вы видите? Да.
Yeah, I mean, one example, going back to our earlier conversation, or just before, about the war in Ukraine, is I do believe that there's either a expressly stated or maybe a self-generated, as you were saying, line about what you can report on the war in Ukraine. I will say that in recent months, we've seen more stories appear in local media about the real situation, about what's really happening on the ground in Ukraine. So it's not as if there's nothing, but compared to many other countries in the world, and what we see in the media there's relatively little coverage about the real atrocities that are being committed on the ground in Ukraine. And I believe that that has something to do with these red lines, that people feel like if they publish it or if they write about it, there's going to be consequences.
Возможно, нам необходимы какие-нибудь институциональные реформы, чтобы журналисты перестали бояться, как вы думаете?
You know, when we say institutional reform, right, that sometimes implies, I don't know if that's what you had in mind, setting up some kind of a new government body or having the agency for media do certain things. And I actually don't think the solution lies on the government side. Mm-hmm. I think it has to come from journalists themselves, their own organization, you know, having an association of journalists or a Profsayuz or something which really represents them. And I won't speak to whether the current ones do or how good a job they're doing. And a feeling that of a sort of professional, it's a professional solidarity in a way that has to form, where journalists collect together and they defend each other.
У нас этого нет, к сожалению.
Yeah.
Да.
And that's something, I mean, that's very strong in the United States. We obviously have a longer tradition of these things, but where journalists, they kind of come together to protect each other and speak out on behalf of each other when one of them gets attacked. And that helps to make people feel braver and more liberated to report on things.
Как вы оцениваете работу фонда масс-медиа, работу господина Камила Анджонова?
To be honest, I don't think I know enough about what they're doing, what they've supported, the projects and so on, to be able to comment. I follow some of the statements that Mr. Alamjanov made in that role. I guess his role has changed now, right? Because he's in the presidential administration. But and I have to say that he's often made very positive, from our point of view, positive comments in defense of journalists or in defense of their right to print their opinions and to be critical. And but beyond that, it's hard for me to comment on the work of the fund per se and what the fund has done, because I just don't know enough about it.
Он о вас отзывался очень хорошо, сказал, что вы очень умный дипломат.
Okay. Хорошо.
Как вы в целом оцениваете свою работу за этот период?
I believe and I feel that my work over this last 3 years has been very fulfilling for me personally and professionally, but also has had some success in terms of the U.S.-Uzbekistan relationship. I was starting with an advantage in a way because my predecessor, Ambassador Spratlin, and the government of Uzbekistan had already done a lot to build the relationship, make it more, cover more areas and go deeper in cooperation. And so I inherited a fairly good situation, but I think we've made some real progress in the last 3 years. I mean, I could go into lots of detail, but just giving you the big picture, I think we have made serious progress in cooperation on security, on economic issues, on political issues, in many respects.
Чем вы особенно гордитесь? Есть какой-то там 1-2 пункта, что вы скажете, так, Дэниел, я молодец, я это сделал?
Well, first of all, I never claim credit for everything because I can't do any of the things I do without an incredible staff at the embassy and, of course, cooperation with our partners here. So I don't think of it as just my accomplishment. But I would say one area that I feel especially proud of is the work we've done on education. When I first came here, I said, if I want to be known as anything, it's the education ambassador. And we have followed through in the last 3 years with an incredibly diverse array of programs and cooperation with the Ministry of Public Education, with the Ministry of Higher Education. We've instituted a lot of exchange programs that give especially young Uzbeks an opportunity to travel to the United States to study high school, university, and other levels. And we've done a lot of work on English language. English language teaching, resources. We've trained more than 15,000 teachers of English, Uzbek teachers of English, to be better teachers, to raise their level and their knowledge of techniques and so on, just in the past 3 years. And so those are the things that I think where we've had the biggest impact during my time here. And it's, again, I don't get all the credit or even a small piece of it, but I do feel that I made it my priority.
По-вашему, что сейчас вообще в образовании Узбекистана происходит?
What's happening in education generally? Yeah.
Да. Если можно, искренне.
Yeah, of course. Everything I say is искренне. I do think that that things are moving in the right direction, but the challenges are huge. I know that the number of people graduating every year from secondary school is, I think it's somewhere around 700,000 or 800,000, and we know that there's not enough jobs for all of them in the economy. And so the solution to that is to raise people's skill level and training. Obviously, there's the whole issue of, do you go abroad to find work or not? That's a whole other question. And I know that the president set a goal of having higher education available to something like 50% of students by a certain date. I can't remember the date now, maybe 2030, 2035. And there has been progress towards that goal, but the challenge is enormous. I mean, you need more professors at universities, you need more classroom space, you need an incredible number of resources to achieve that goal. And improving the quality of primary and secondary education for younger kids is also a challenge because many of the teachers were trained a long time ago. They don't have the latest techniques of teaching. The classrooms, the infrastructure is not what it should be. I've seen schools that have been improved tremendously. I've visited schools where the infrastructure is a lot better than it was 3 years ago, but that's only a small number of the total. There's a big challenge, and I know this from talking to the Minister of Public Education. So progress, yes, but a long way to go.
Еще один такой довольно, мне кажется, сложный вопрос. Наверняка вы знали, что какова была ситуация в первые годы независимости, да, что было в Узбекистане, скажем, там, первые 15 лет, 20 лет. Система образования была разрушена практически. Как вы думаете, это было сделано намеренно или это как бы тот опыт, который стране необходимо было пройти. Благодаря этой сломанной системе образования мы, собственно, имеем несколько миллионов людей, которые ездят на заработки и занимаются там паденным трудом, гастарбайтеры и так далее, так далее. Вот этот вот весь механизм, почему так произошло, по-вашему?
You know, I can't really say whether it was done intentionally or not, like on purpose, right? I find it hard to believe that any government or any leadership would intentionally ruin a country's education. I tend to think that it was a result of an unwillingness to learn from experience from other countries and bring in expertise from other countries. It was also maybe a desire not to open the country up as much to the outside world, but to keep it a little more contained and enclosed. And if you don't invest in the knowledge and the skills of your youth, the country doesn't have a future. And I think that was the leadership failed to see that and to realize it. I do think that the current leadership recognizes the legacy that they inherited and recognizes how much work has to be done and is trying to do something about it. And as I said earlier, the wheels have been put in motion to make major improvements, but things were so bad, as you point out, and it's so complicated that it's going to take a while for it to really get to sort of world-class standards.
В каких отраслях реформы дали свой результат, а в каких нет, как вы думаете?
So one reform that I think, which a lot of people don't include it in the list of reforms, but I think it should be, is foreign policy reform, not domestic. And I think in that respect, one of the most impactful changes that President Mirziyoyev made was his change in attitude towards the neighbors. This idea that the first thing we need to do is improve our relationship with our immediate neighbors, make it easier for people to travel across borders, increase trade, and resolve problems and resolve disputes and conflicts. And that was something I know he talked about from the very beginning of the presidency, and then set out to do things, concrete things to achieve that goal. And I think that's one of the big successes of the reform. I also think that in the economic area, a lot of the early reforms that were adopted, currency convertibility, tax reform, customs reform, regulatory reform, have had a positive impact. They've made the environment better for businesses to operate, for people to grow their businesses, for the private sector to emerge to some extent, and that's all very positive. I do think that some of the more ambitious, bigger areas of reform haven't shown results yet. I'm not saying that the direction is not good. The direction is good, but I think they haven't shown results yet. One example is, staying on the economic theme, is privatization. There have been very ambitious goals set for privatizing a certain number of enterprises, and so far it's gone really slowly and with some mixed results.
Почему, как вы думаете?
I think it's in part because the enterprises that are being privatized are often playing a bigger function in their community. They're providing a lot of services, and so it's not as simple as just saying we're going to turn it over to a private owner. There's lots of problems that have to be resolved. I also think that they're very likely, and I can't cite specific examples or give you facts and figures on this, but what the experts tell me who track this is that in many cases there are vested interests who have an interest in not having the enterprise privatized because they're profiting now. So I suspect that there's a little bit of opposition or resistance to some of the privatizations as well. But we've seen some good examples and some not so good examples of privatization. And so we know it's possible. One of what we think is a good example that we saw last year in 2021 was Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola bottling was privatized. The Coca-Cola affiliate in Turkey won the tender. And by all accounts that I've heard, it was conducted in a transparent way with information being provided to potential bidders. There was a competition, there were criteria, and Coca-Cola Coca-Cola Turkey won the tender. In other cases, it hasn't worked that way. So It's a work in progress. And then I guess the last thing I would say is that when you talk about areas where the results, we haven't seen the results yet, some of the things that I was talking about earlier on education, healthcare sector, where there's big reform efforts underway, it's still a work in progress. And I don't think necessarily people are seeing the results in their daily lives, that they're not feeling the results of that. And that's a challenge.
Судебная система также, мне кажется, по-вашему, почему, мне кажется, одна из самых отстающих областей в реформах, нет?
I don't know that it's necessarily the остающий. I'm not sure that that's true objectively, but the reforms haven't gone as far as one would have hoped in that area. One thing we did, and by the way, we're heavily engaged in the judicial sector and rule of law, providing assistance to the Supreme Court, to the Ministry of Justice, to the law schools, and especially the academy that trains prosecutors, the Prosecutor General's Academy. And we've seen a change in attitude in those institutions and a willingness to accept that the judicial branch needs to be independent of other branches of government, and that rule of law should be the governing principle that drives everything. But again, it has to start with education of people, people kind of coming up through a system with a certain idea of what justice is, what the rule of law means, and then it will begin to be felt by people more. One project we did that I think we completed a year or two ago was to automate the systems for all of the commercial courts. So not the criminal courts and not the civil, but the commercial courts. And that was, by most accounts, really successful because it helps to remove the human factor from a lot of things by having everything available online and having a lot of the cases automated. That project is now being carried out in the civil courts. So gradually, it will hopefully become prevalent everywhere in the court system.
В Узбекистане когда-нибудь будут независимые суды, как вы думаете? Возможно ли такое? Потому что мы, как журналисты, как блогеры, понятно, что ведется работа, что выполняется там образовательная работа с нашими судебной, там, юридической и так далее, системами. Но суды, собственно, как были не независимы, так они и остались. У нас очень часто до сих пор в СМИ попадают случаи, скажем, с коррупционными элементами и так далее, и так далее.
I hope that they will be truly independent someday. It's hard to make predictions in this business. I do think that there's good intentions on the part of a lot of people involved in the leadership of the judicial system, that they themselves believe in the importance of being independent, of having all the resources necessary for that to happen. At the same time, I recognize, and I think they recognize, that it's very hard to change political and cultural traditions, right? If there's a certain tradition, a certain way of doing business where the executive gets involved in judicial decisions, indirectly or directly, it's not easy to change that. It's part of the political culture. Mm-hmm. So I try to be optimistic about these things, because I don't see any other alternative, and I do. So my answer is I believe that it can be independent, but I can't say that I will predict it will absolutely happen. It requires decisions to be made and people to, decide they want it that way.
В целом, я так понимаю, что у посла США все оптимистично касаемо Узбекистана.
Yes.
Поправки в Конституцию – одна из самых таких злободневных тем в Узбекистане последние месяцы. Как вы оцениваете процедуру сбора этих самых поправок и взаимодействия с общественностью?
So, first of all, the United States is not in a position, and we don't, set ourselves up in such a place to tell another country what should be or not be in their constitution. So I won't, comment on specific changes. Yeah. But as far as the process goes, I think it's very important to get public comments, and I know that that's been prioritized as something to collect opinions from society. I also think it's important to get reaction from international experts, and I think some efforts have been made in that direction, but there can always be more. The OSCE Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe has experts who are very skilled at analyzing constitutions, looking internationally for best practices. So I think that's also important. I will say that, any change that increases checks and balances in the system, or that better guarantees the rights and freedoms of citizens, is a good thing. So I think that if it's moving in that direction, then it is good. But I will make one observation about the international reaction to all of this, which I think is just what I've observed from talking to colleagues and reading international media. Regardless of what changes are proposed and go into the referendum, the one that everyone will focus on has to do with the presidential term limits. I think that's what the focus has been and will be. So whatever the intention is, that's what the international perception will be. And I know there's debate going on about that question. I've read some of it, I've seen it, and it's good that there be debate about what is the right way to approach it. I will just say that, I hope that Uzbekistan's government and citizens will look closely at sort of the risks and benefits changing the current term limits. If you look at world experience, there unfortunately is a pattern where if you eliminate term limits or if you extend them for very long periods of time, you end up with government that's not as accountable to the people. It's just what, it's what happens in real life. So I do think that Uzbekistan, its people, its government should be very careful about how they approach that question.
Хорошо. Если мы говорим в реалиях Узбекистана, да, понятно, что есть американские реалии, там европейские, российские. Вроде бы в стране все идет неплохо, да? Вы об этом тоже говорите. Если нынешнему президенту элементарно может не хватить времени до выполнения всех реформ, об этом говорил Садык Салихович Сафаев. Как быть в этом случае?
Yeah, so this is it's a very difficult, it's a dilemma. It's a real dilemma for countries to face. As we were discussing earlier, the reforms and how things are going in the reforms, I kept saying, this will take a long time, right? This is not easy, this is complicated, this will take. And so I understand the instinct of people to say, because it takes a long time and because we trust the leadership of the current president, he needs to be around to see it through, to see it to the end. So that's understandable. And there's a logic. There is a logic to that, right? But at the same time, I do think every country, and this is true in the United States too, has to weigh these things against other risks. So there are risks to not seeing through a reform program and believing that there's only one leader who can see it through. And then the risk on the other side is creating a system where there's not enough checks and balances, where there's not enough accountability, and where, as a result, things go badly for the people of the country. So, I mean, a good example of this is in our own country, in the United States, right? So I've heard people refer to Franklin Roosevelt in this debate about what to do here and say, well, look, Franklin Roosevelt was elected 4 times. He actually only served 3 terms because he died very early in his 4th term, so he was only there for 12 or 13 years. But nonetheless, that was the first time in American history that a president had been elected so often. And arguably, he was a great leader who led us through a very difficult period in our history and got us through the Depression and World War II. But what was the reaction in the United States? Well, just a few years after Roosevelt died, we passed an amendment to the Constitution saying that a president could only have 2 terms and no more. And that has been abided by ever since. And there's no debate in America now about changing that. So every country has to make its own choice about how it wants to balance those risks. But I just hope, as I said before, that Uzbekistan will carefully consider the step it's taking and realize that there may be some downside risk to it, and maybe adopt some measures to avoid those risks. I don't know what those would be, but I'm just saying, take that into account.
Политика США в Узбекистане и Центральной Азии. В 2020 году США опубликовали новую стратегию по Центральной Азии. Она охватывала период 2019-2025. В числе ее основных принципов поддержка и укрепление суверенитета и независимости стран Центральной Азии как в отдельности, так и в регионе в целом. Можете вкратце, если помните, перечислить несколько основных принципов этой стратегии?
And I think that the stress, the emphasis of that strategy has been on two basic principles, two goals, I would say. One is what you just mentioned, which is sovereignty and independence, that we want countries to be able to stand up on their own 2 feet and stand up for their own interests and not have to, comply with some pressure from outside. And the other is stability, in the sense that we want countries in Central Asia to develop in a way that provides benefits and prosperity to the population, that provides good government, that is the government that serves the interests of the people, and that has the ability to defend itself, not just its borders, but also from bad things like crime and terrorists and drugs and that sort of thing. And the reason why we want all those things to happen is because we have an interest in the region staying stable. What happened in the 1990s in Afghanistan is still very much a lesson for the United States, which is if you neglect a country and allow instability to fester, to develop, it will eventually hurt us at home. I mean, that's maybe an extreme example where, there's a direct line between Afghanistan instability, growth of terrorism, 9/11. Right? There's a direct connection between those things. But we took a lesson from that, I think, which was we have to pay attention to how stable countries are. And stability is about all those things I just mentioned. It's about good government, it's about economic development and prosperity, and it's about having the capacity to provide your own security.
С учетом событий в Украине, Казахстане, Каракалпакстане, изменилась ли стратегия, как вы думаете?
Actually, not really. I mean, first of all, that strategy that you referred to was adopted in the previous administration under President Trump, although it remains in place. It hasn't been repealed. I suspect that the Biden administration will want to have its own strategy. I don't expect it to be that different. And even despite the events that you mentioned, the war in Ukraine, the unrest in Kazakhstan, and then most recently the incidents in Karakalpakstan, if anything, I think those events reinforce the principles of the strategy. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't take into account that they happened. Of course we should, but this idea of how do you support sovereignty and independence, and how can we best provide the help that will allow those things to occur, this idea of stability through good government and economic growth, those things are, if anything, more important than they were before these recent events.
Вернемся к стратегии. В ней США признают, что безопасный и стабильный Афганистан – это один из главных приоритетов для правителей Центральной Азии. Собственно, мы все должны собраться и обеспечить Афганистану стабильность, поддержать мирный процесс и так далее, и так далее. При этом Соединенные Штаты не торопятся разморозить миллиарды долларов Афганистана, как этого просит Талибан. Цитата исполняющего главы МИД Афганистана Амиара Хан Муттаки, она звучит, что американцы отключили им воду для полива в саду, а потом требуют от них показать плоды, выращенные в этом саду. Такая поэзия прекрасная. Не противоречит ли это стратегии, как вы думаете?
Okay, so a couple of thoughts on this. First of all, remember that the strategy was written before, when we still had troops in Afghanistan and the situation was very different. It dates back a couple of years. However, that said, the basic principle of wanting there to be a stable and developing Afghanistan still applies, and not least because it has major effects on the security of Central Asian countries. So there's no change in that idea. When it comes to the dealings with the Taliban government there and questions about the release of assets and so on, there's been a lot written and said about this. I won't try to repeat everything that our spokespeople have said. Our special representative for Afghanistan, Tom West, was here in July. Before that, he actually was here in May, so he's been twice in the past few months. He's done press interviews and has explained our approach. I'll just say in brief that The U.S. remains committed to provide humanitarian aid to the people of Afghanistan. We're the biggest single contributor to the international humanitarian aid effort. We've also found ways of having some of those assets released for the purposes of humanitarian aid. And there are continuing talks going on about the remaining parts of the assets. One complication is, as you may know, there's actually a court case in the United States that was brought by the families of the victims of the 9/11 attacks, the September 11 attacks, where they essentially are suing the Taliban or suing the authorities in Afghanistan now for damages because of the death of their loved ones. And because of that court case, a certain portion of those assets in the banks are judicially frozen, you might say. They're not touchable because our courts have said, until this case is resolved, the money has to stay there. Nonetheless, as I said, we've been in ongoing discussions directly with the Taliban. I mean, we engage directly with them. Mr. West himself, Tom West, talks to Taliban officials on a regular basis. And we're trying to find ways to make sure that resources get to the people who need it in Afghanistan. And there's no question that there's a humanitarian need that's very significant.
А кто сейчас помогает фактически Талибан проводить реформы, как вы думаете? И проводятся ли они там вообще, по вашему мнению?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure that reform is the right word to refer to the policies of the Taliban regime right now. If anything, it's regression. There seems to be a return back to some of the practices that they carried out in the 1990s, especially with respect to the rights of women and girls. And we have very serious concerns about it, as does Uzbekistan and most of the rest of the world. So, but I don't know your question about who's giving them advice. The United Nations has a presence in Afghanistan, but they are focused almost exclusively, as I understand it, on humanitarian aid, just getting food and shelter and resources to people who need it in the country. And that's true of most international donors right now. That's the focus.
Как вы относитесь к тому, что Узбекистан тепло принимает Талибан, а Российская Федерация тепло принимает Талибан? Даст ли это какие-то плоды в целом, как вы думаете?
You know, we spend a lot of time coordinating our policy with the government of Uzbekistan and discussing with them, trying to make sure that we're on the same page when it comes to Afghanistan. And I think we are. We understand that Uzbekistan has to, really, in many respects, has to have a friendly relationship with its neighbor, just for reasons of security and ensuring stability on both sides of the border. They need to have a dialogue, and more than a dialogue, they need to have a relationship, right? So we understand that. But at the same time, the government of Uzbekistan has been very clear to us and publicly that they will not formally recognize the government of the Taliban government, Taliban regime, until certain conditions are met and until there's an international consensus to do so. And those conditions, going back to what I was alluding to earlier, are respect for human rights, especially the rights of girls and women, an inclusive government that really represents all aspects of Afghanistan society, and this is a really important one, especially in light of recent events, a true commitment to preventing terrorist groups from operating on Afghan soil. And of course, we recently saw with the sudden appearance and then disappearance of Mr. Zawahiri that there's some question as to their commitment to that principle. So the government of Uzbekistan has been consistent and clear with us and with the world that they are pushing for those same results. And at the same time, they're going to maintain a practical working relationship with the Taliban government, and that's something that we understand.
Вернемся на год назад. Что, собственно, произошло в Афганистане в 2021 году? Почему американский контингент так спешно покинул Афганистан? Для нас это выглядело таким образом.
Yeah. The decision to pull out our troops actually was made long before it actually happened. You'll recall that there was an agreement signed by the previous administration, the Trump administration, with the Taliban in Doha, I believe in February of 2020, if I'm not mistaken, something like that. Maybe, yeah, I think it was in early 2020. And that agreement specified that the intention of the United States was to withdraw its troops. Now, there were a number of conditions set and a number of steps that had to be taken on both sides for that to happen. When President Biden came to office, he inherited that agreement. He thought it was important to honor the agreement and not to revoke it for the sake of consistency in policy. And he also had a view that was the result of a lot of his own previous experience and the U.S. experience in Afghanistan, that it was time for us to end our military involvement. Didn't mean we would end all involvement forever or that we wouldn't still care about security and stability, those things we were talking about earlier in Afghanistan, but it was time to pull our troops out. And so it was announced months in advance, and at the time of the actual pullout, the time that the troops were leaving, I think part of what we all observed was something that nobody predicted would happen, which was that the Taliban would gain control of all the levers of power and march into Kabul within a matter of 10 days or something. I may be off by a day or two, but something like that. No military experts, no intelligence experts, no foreign policy commentators believed that that would happen or that that was possible. And I think that in part of the what seemed to be hastiness, speed about it, came out of that situation, which nobody predicted. It's unfortunate. In the end, we were able to evacuate an incredible number of people who needed to be evacuated in a very short period of time. And as I said before, even though it certainly isn't the outcome that the U.S. government would have wished for, especially with the Taliban taking over so quickly, we have remained committed to engage and to figure out ways to make sure that both terrorism doesn't return, and it doesn't become a platform for terrorism, and that the people of Afghanistan are helped in their time of need.
Когда это все случилось, американские СМИ сообщали, что, уйдя из Афганистана, США все-таки хотели бы сохранить свое присутствие в Центральной Азии, быть рядом, для чего им нужны, по сути, военные объекты, да, военные базы. Как было это в Кыргызстане, Манас была база, в Узбекистане был Ханабад. Эти две базы закрылись по требованию властей. Сегодня Таджикистан член, да, АУДКБ, он без согласования не сможет разместить и, скорее всего, не разместит американскую военную базу. Узбекистан тоже, в Узбекистане прописано в Конституции невозможность размещения иностранного контингента. Как США планирует решать этот вопрос с присутствием в Центральной Азии? И планирует ли вообще?
Yeah, so this is a question that I've gotten a lot over the past few years, or that's come up a lot, it's the persistence of the question tells me that people are not hearing my answer. And the question keeps coming back. So I'll say again what I've said before.
Мы ждем, что вы скажете что-то новое.
The U.S. is not asking and hasn't been asking the countries of Central Asia to establish military bases, and we do not plan to. So there's no plan, there's no intention to establish military bases in Central Asia. So, all the things you said are accurate as far as, Tajikistan being part of the CSTO and Uzbekistan having a law and policy of not having foreign military bases on its soil. We are fully aware of that, and but in a way it's kind of irrelevant because we're not asking for bases. We don't think it would be our proposal would be accepted anyway. I mean, because the countries have made that clear. But regardless of that, it's not on the agenda. So there is no plan, no intention,
Можно
no
ли сказать,
idea
что
of having military
США
bases.
теряет влияние в регионе? Можно ли об этом сказать?
I don't think so. I mean, there's no question that during the war in Afghanistan, when we had troops there, and by the way, I should emphasize that troop deployment was strongly supported by the countries of the region, including the Russian Federation originally when it first went into effect, because they actually saw it as the best guarantee of stability in Afghanistan. And over the years, we got a lot of support from You mentioned the Manas base in Kyrgyzstan. For a while, there was a base in Uzbekistan. But beyond that, there was a lot of support for just bringing things in and out, because you have to support, if you have a military contingent, you have to support them with lots of goods and services. So we got a lot of very good cooperation from countries in the region, and there was a lot of cooperation on that point. So now that's been removed, in a sense, right? So the military presence isn't there. But in a way, I see it as an opportunity to have even closer relations with countries in the region, because now the relationship is very clearly about our bilateral interests, right? It's not about our interests with a third country or a fourth country or a fifth country. It's bilateral. And so Uzbekistan and other countries of the region, I can't speak with the same knowledge because I'm not there, but certainly in Uzbekistan, the government is very clear that they want more cooperation with us. There's no pulling back from it. They want security cooperation with us. They want economic cooperation. They want investment, of course, from American companies here. They want cultural and educational exchanges. So, you know, I don't know how one measures influence, you know, less, more, whatever. The fact of the matter is that the relationship with the United States is important to Uzbekistan, and if anything, they want more of it. So I take that as a measure that things are in a good place.
Еще один вопрос, он довольно прямой, и он меня, честно сказать, беспокоит. Я много езжу по регионам, по Узбекистану. Как вы относитесь к тому, что довольно большое количество населения Узбекистана в регионах, как правило, они скорее поддерживают РФ, нежели чем действия Запада? С чем это связано, как вы думаете?
Yeah, you know, it's hard to... I understand where you get that impression, and I hear similar things. It would be interesting for me to get some sort of reliable polling data, which I don't see very much of, you know, surveys of public opinion, so you really understood what people thought. But to the extent it's true, I think it has a lot to do with information and media. You know, a lot of people consume media coming from Russia. It's well produced, you know, it's entertaining, and it's relentless. There's a lot of it being pushed out all the time. Also, the migrant, you know, the 2 or 3 million migrant workers in Russia means that there's a lot of back and forth, and there's a lot of family ties that grow up and so on between the two countries. And then, of course, there's just the heritage of the past, you know, historical tradition, cultural ties. And those are very strong factors, very strong forces. So it doesn't surprise me to hear figures that indicate that. At the same time, I will just say that this is not statistical, it's not based on data, but just based on my impressions when I travel around the country, or when people from our embassy travel. There's a huge reservoir of goodwill towards America and towards the United States. You know, I can't measure it, I can't put numbers on it, but it's definitely there. I see it in people's faces and hear it in my conversations with them. I also see it in the desire for visas to come to the United States, which is huge and growing. And in fact, the first question I get when I travel around the country is usually something about a visa. That's
Как я могу получить визу?
Right. And so anyway, that tells me that there's a lot of both interest and warm feelings towards the United States. Even if it may be true that statistically, you know, more people have these favorable views of the Russian Federation.
События в Каракалпакстане. Как вы восприняли протесты в Нукусе? Для вас это событие стало новостью, или вы что-то знали?
So, well, it was definitely... first of all, it happened when I was in the United States, so I wasn't here in the country, but of course I heard about it very soon after it happened. And, you know, the first thing I want to say is, you know, just from a personal point of view, is how sad I am and how sorry I feel for the families of those who lost loved ones in the violence. I think there was an estimate, or there's been an estimate of 21 dead, although I've heard other estimates that it may be higher, and that's a tragedy, of course. Also, you know, we think it's important, and we've communicated to the government, and I know other international partners have done the same, that there be a credible and full, very thorough and independent investigation of what happened. We were very happy, very pleased to see the announcement of the commission that was formed, and We know the Commission's doing its work. We've occasionally talked to members of the Commission to kind of get updates on how it's going. And we hope that the result of that will be first of all, an accounting of how many deaths and who the victims were, because we still haven't seen any kind of a list of who was killed, and a deeper analysis of what happened and what caused it. I know that the president went to the region immediately. He immediately made some changes in the constitutional process to account for what he took to be the public sentiment there, and I think that's all good. But again, we're hoping and expecting that that this commission will be allowed to do its work, will provide some recommendations and an analysis of what happened, and most importantly, to deal with the underlying causes, the things that made these things happen.
Что, по вашему мнению, стало триггером беспорядков? Потому что Шавкат Мирзиёев, он сослался на внешние враждебные силы и движения. То есть кто-то пытался раскачать ситуацию. То же самое было и в Казахстане, например. По-вашему, что послужило причиной?
I don't know enough, and I'm not in a position to speculate on the causes or on this statement about external forces being involved. I don't know what that means, and I would like to know more about what officials who say that have in mind. I will say that it appears from what we read and what we have heard that that there was this kind of catalyst or spark, you might say, that had something to do with the constitutional amendments that were being proposed. But it does appear that something more was happening, that there was something else, because it would be hard to explain the level of conflict that occurred and the violence purely based on the constitutional amendments. So, but again, I don't have any theories and I don't have any other data or information, so all the more reason why we're eager to see what the Commission reports.
Вы заметили, что крупные СМИ и блогеры почти не освещали конфликт, события в Каракалпакстане?
Yes, I mean, we noticed that the amount of coverage was less than one would expect, given what happened, given the dramatic nature of what happened.
Как вы думаете, с чем это связано?
Well, again, I mean, going back to our earlier conversation about journalism and freedom of speech, I suspect that there was maybe there was some self-censorship or people just being uncomfortable reporting on what was happening because they were afraid of what might happen if they reported the wrong way. And I suspect that maybe, again, on this I am speculating, that maybe the local authorities in particular might have told journalists, like, don't pay attention to this, don't report stories. But I don't know that was the case.
Тема, которая вам точно нравится – экология. Вопрос экологии водных ресурсов. Ученые и международные организации очень много говорят о том, что в регионе возможна засуха, что будет дефицит воды, пыльные бури будут увеличиваться в Центральной Азии. Вы обсуждаете с правительством эти темы, с нашим?
Yes, we do talk a lot with the government about it, and also with non-governmental organizations that are working on environmental issues. It's probably the most important threat to the future of Uzbekistan, really. If you look over the long term, the loss of water, the melting of the glaciers in the mountains to the east, and the reduced flows that will eventually result in rivers, it's a serious threat. We have a number of projects that we're supporting, especially through USAID, that are about more efficient water usage in farming, or helping reform the system of payment for water, for example. I know there was one project that I had a chance to see myself in Bukhara, right near the border with Turkmenistan, that was about providing new irrigation pumping equipment that was much more efficient than the previous. I think it gave something like 40,000 farmers access to irrigated water, but did it in a way, reduced all the waste, because there's a lot of waste and there's a lot of losses that occur. So all the experts tell me that there's huge gains to be made by better use of water, more efficient use of water. And that's the future that Uzbekistan needs to focus on. And of course, we also want to cooperate, and we talk a lot with the government about the international commitments with respect to climate change and the pledges that Uzbekistan and most other countries have made to reduce greenhouse gas by certain percentages. So that's something that we're also very closely tied up on.
Как в людях самих можно пробудить вот экоактивизм, скажем так, чтобы они были более мудро поступали с ресурсами? Как вы думаете?
Well, I suppose one way would be to take everyone to Moynak to look at the what used to be the RLC, because that's such a dramatic illustration of it, and it really has an impact. I mean, I know a lot of people have gone there, and there's probably been films and television programs. It's not as if no one has seen it, but I really think it's important, and starting from a young age, in schools, to make people understand the implications of their actions, right, and on the environment, and just more awareness how human activity can create these environmental challenges is the starting point. And then, of course, you have to give people something practical that they can do themselves, right? Some projects, and I'm not saying this is the only idea out there, but I remember on Earth Day this year, so in April, which is the international so-called Earth Day, I went to the Agricultural Institute in Tashkent, the Tashkent Agricultural Institute, and we did we planted some trees, and I know there's a much bigger effort underway all over the country to plant trees. But what was interesting to me was that the students at the Agricultural Institute had a competition to come up with projects using technology to improve environmental outcomes. And some of the winning students, the ones who won the competition, presented their project. And it was sort of a tagging of trees. So you would put these sort of geo-tracking devices on trees as they're planted, and then that would feed into a database which would track over time the health of trees and also give you a map of the distribution of tree planting all over the country. I was surprised actually that nothing like that already existed, because it seemed so obvious, but to me it was very inspiring to see these young people, 20 years old or whatever, 19 years old, so committed and engaged to their country's environmental future. And how to spread that out and do more of it, it's a challenge, but I think that Uzbekistan needs to do it. The United States needs to do it too.
США включили Узбекистан в список потенциальных поставщиков подсанкционных товаров. Что это означает и чем это грозит Узбекистану, если будут выявлены нарушения?
Yeah, so I think that that list, which was a fairly big list, was mostly covering countries where there's a lot of business activity between Russia and that country. Mm-hmm. And so, it's viewed as a potential risk that this could happen. That was it's not intended as an accusation that it is happening or, evidence that it's happening, but simply that there's a risk. I will say that the government of Uzbekistan has been very clear with us, and I think publicly as well, that they want to comply with the sanctions, that they don't want Uzbek companies to be subject to secondary sanctions, and they also don't want Uzbekistan to be a country of evasion that's being used as a place to get around the sanctions. And they've consulted with us very thoroughly, with our experts on the sanctions regime at the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department. They've gotten a lot of information. I think they've also gotten advice from law firms who are experts in this, private law firms. So I do believe that the government is very committed to this idea of not facilitating sanctions evasion. And that, from our standpoint, that's a very good thing.
Джонатан Хеник, ваш преемник, что мы о нем можем интересно узнать?
So Jonathan is a friend and a colleague who I've known for 20 years at least. He is very familiar with this region of the world. Mm-hmm. His first job in the Foreign Service 30 years ago was in Tashkent. He served at our embassy here. He was very young and junior officer at the time, but he worked in here, and I think he even studied some Uzbek at the time before he came. And subsequently, he worked in Azerbaijan. He's had several jobs in Turkey, including currently where he serves as the Consul General in Istanbul. He runs our consulate in Istanbul. And so he brings, some language skills, knowledge of the region. He served for 4 years as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Central Asia, which is the same job I had previously. So he really knows the issues in the region. But just as important, maybe more important, he's a good person. He's somebody who he enjoys interacting with other people. He listens. He respects cultural traditions. He'll come here, as I tried to 3 years ago, wanting to learn and to understand what's happening and wanting to help and do good things. So I think he'll be a fantastic ambassador. Uzbekistan is lucky to have him as our representative, and I look forward to seeing how he does. I think he'll do great.
В ходе выступления в Сенате он заявил, что будет поддерживать защиту прав лиц с нетрадиционной сексуальной ориентацией, а также религиозных меньшинств и женщин. Это вызвало небольшой резонанс в узбекских СМИ. У нас все, что связано с ЛГБТ, очень большие резонансы всегда вызывает. Насколько эта тема вообще злободневна для Узбекистана?
So, I think the issue of respect for small minority groups and their rights is an issue and is a problem. It's one that I've talked about before in other interviews and conversations here. I think there's an awareness that it's a problem and that some steps have been taken to address it. I do believe that I think that there is goodwill to try to address it, but I think it is a problem. And I think of just a few examples that I could cite that I've encountered myself. There are some Christian groups here who are what we would call Protestant groups or evangelical Protestant groups who have had problems over the years trying to register their churches or conduct their worship services in peace. And I think they're not mainstream, right? They're not part of the big religious confessions. They're not Sunni Muslim, they're not Russian Orthodox, they're not Catholic, they're not Jewish, right? So there's a certain amount of just mystery about who they are, and there's unfortunately a lot of disinformation out there about what these groups are about. We have had many dialogues over the years to the government about allowing these groups to exist in peace. If they're not disturbing their neighbors, they're not doing anything to disrupt society, but they're just trying to worship among themselves and have their own community, they should be left alone, and they should be allowed to legally exist and have registered churches. So that's one example of the kind of thing where I've seen some improvement in the last 5-6 years, but where there's more to be done. And again, I think some of the problem comes in local communities where it feels strange to people because it's unfamiliar, and so they react in a negative way. But it's important in any society, I think, that wants to be known for its respect for human rights and freedoms, to say that has to apply even to the people who are really different from you. Not just the people who are a little bit different, but even the people who are really different, you also have to respect them. Again, there are rules and laws and norms in society about, you can't commit crimes against people, you can't espouse violence, you can't break the law. But if you're within your community just wanting to observe your practices and your beliefs, and you're not, breaking any laws, you should be allowed to do that in peace. And I think that it's important for that principle to be emphasized.
Это все прекрасно, я абсолютно разделяю точку зрения, но что касается того же самого сообщества ЛГБТ, население не принимает. Почему-то мне это неизвестно. Как здесь быть? Как тут поступать, как вы думаете? Это связано с религией, это связано с культурными особенностями. Мне кажется, можно ли насаждать непонятные населению ценности? Не приведет ли это к проблемам еще большим?
It is a challenge, unquestionably. I guess what I come back to is the experience of my own country. Because if I go back to my childhood, which was a long time ago, I won't say how many years ago, it's a long time ago, you know, the attitudes and legal rights of LGBTQ people were extremely limited. There was a lot of intolerance, a lot of hostility, just for being who they were, and something that they couldn't change about themselves. They were made to feel a lot of hostility and discrimination. And the change that's occurred in the United States has been a gradual change over 30 or 40 years. It didn't happen overnight. And the change happened because people started to realize that people who were LGBT were their neighbors, or their son, or their friend, or their cousin. And they were just regular people who had a different approach to who they loved, right? And I know that I know it's hard. It's really hard for people to get out of what they've been taught and what the culture tells them. But it can happen. It can happen, and I've seen it happen in my own lifetime and in my own country. So I believe it can, and I hope it does. But for now, it remains a very difficult subject here in Uzbekistan.
Последний вопрос. Что нас ждет на наш регион в ближайшие 3 месяца? Я знаю, что вы не любите предсказания, вы несколько раз об этом сказали, но несколько мыслей Дэниела Розенблюма по этому поводу. Есть очень много мнений. Говорят, в сентябре закончится война, там, СВО, кто как называет. Что будет с регионом, как вы думаете, в ближайшее время? К чему нам быть готовыми, скажем так?
Yeah, so I believe that we have not yet seen the full impact on the region of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I expect that as the months go by, we'll begin to see more and more effects of that. I don't know what all of those will be, but I think that it was a wake-up call to countries in this region who realized that they need to have alternatives to their reliance on a single partner, that they cannot afford to be so dependent on that partner they can't express their own opinions, or they can't adopt their own policy positions without fear of consequences. I mean, we've heard this stated very explicitly, really, by the president of Kazakhstan when he said recently that it's a national priority for Kazakhstan to find alternative routes for its oil exports, because, as we know, their oil mostly transits Russian territory, and the Russians showed that they would turn off that tap, very easily if they wanted to. So that's in some ways the most obvious example, but I think even in other more subtle ways, we're going to see over time countries recognizing that they need to diversify more their relationships, and that they can't rely on a single partner for their basic needs and their basic economy. So I would say in the coming months, in the coming years, that's a trend that we're gonna observe and we're gonna see.
Супер. Спасибо большое. Надеюсь, не сильно вам надоел.
Спасибо.